back to pragmatics, continuous pragmatics, and so we were talking about that kind of falls under what we call socio-pragmatics, the social aspect of pragmatics, and we're going to continue talking about that today. Then also get more into sort of the structural discourse pragmatics. So in linguistics, discourse is not just spoken or conversational, but in linguistics, discourse can also refer to text. So we'll look at text pragmatics, discourse pragmatics, where, for example, the contextual considerations and information management considerations affect the linguistic structure of sentences and extended periods of text. So above the sentence, you've got a level of discourse where pragmatic considerations can affect your choice of sentence structure, pronouns, and things like that. Kind of discourse analysis sort of stuff. You call it discourse analysis, and that's maybe kind of where you look at how pragmatics affect linguistic structure. So you got socio-pragmatics, and you got kind of more discourse analysis, discourse pragmatic stuff. Then there's kind of like more formal pragmatics, which is kind of like formal semantics, and I'm not going to get into that. It's probably not as... So some key concepts we talked about. Felicity means it's something is pragmatically awkward, it doesn't work, it leads to communication breakdown, and successful speakers, interlocutors would not really say it. We talked about the cooperative principle and various maxims and how flouting those maxims leads to implicature, different kinds of implicature. And then politeness, we're going to continue talking about politeness, particular aspects of politeness, or face politeness as it's specifically called in the Brown and Levinson theory, and face-threatening acts. So something that might impinge upon negative politeness potentially is a face-threatening act, an FTA. If somebody makes a request, if somebody interrupts you, somebody asks you to do something you don't want to do, somebody orders you to do something, those are, in a sense, a face-threatening act. Because face is defined sort of like in the East Asian sense here, in terms of your sense and the other person's sense of autonomy, dignity, autonomy, like I want to keep doing what I'm doing, I don't want to be interrupted, I don't want requests foisted upon me. Sense of esteem, reputation, preferences, opinions, etc. are to be respected, and that's the idea of face in pragmatics. So again, positive politeness refers to devices that affirm person's status and autonomy and reputation. Negative politeness refers to devices, linguistic devices for mitigating a face threat or imposition upon another person. First, let's do the daily poll here. Someone giving a dinner party, and guests from different countries have different ideas about when they should arrive. And so the daily poll question is this. If, let's say, you are hosting a dinner party at your apartment, and your invitation says 7 o'clock. Your invitation says 7 o'clock. In your culture, what time do you expect the guests to actually start knocking on the door? Well, things like this are good to know if you are maybe going to be working for an international company and you're dealing with people from other cultures. Things like this, cultural differences, things like this. You give an invitation, and you can study the pragmatics of giving and accepting invitations, by the way, too, and there are cross-cultural differences in how you, whether you're supposed to say yes or how you can say no to an invitation. Sometimes in some cultures, if somebody invites you to a party, you're supposed to come. You're socially obligated if certain kinds of people with certain status. And then when you come, what time do you come? And these are things you want to know if you're going to be dealing with international cultures, like in an international company, or if you're going to study abroad, or work abroad, and so on. I'll say a little bit more about the value of pragmatics later on. Positive politeness. Let's talk about some devices for positive politeness. A lot of these come from Brown and Levinson. You can look them up. They have a really famous book. It's just called Politeness, if you're interested in this. Some of these might work for negative politeness too. Things like some ways of establishing common ground with you and the other person. Things like compliments, sometimes even exaggerated compliments or expressions of interest or sympathy or approval. And I see this, for example, conferences sometimes here in Korea. I see some really famous person gives a conference talk. It was bloody boring and awful, but the moderator will say, "Thank you for that very interesting talk." Obviously, it's not a sincere compliment, but I guess that's a Korean thing. And in American culture, I wouldn't say anything. "Yeah, thank you. I really needed a nap. Thank you so much for that talk." No, I wouldn't say that. Yeah, we wouldn't say anything. Inclusion, like the inclusive we, for example. In-group identity markers, there might be certain words that you use or certain expressions, especially slang, or switching to dialect if you are from the same kind of dialect group or region. For example, we talked a little bit about like and how young people in English in Britain and in the US, Canada, for example, use like a lot. Like, like, it was like, think money, my own business, like, and this dude come up, like, Why do young people use that? One reason is that the excessive use of like is a group identity marker. It's saying like, we belong to this group of cool teenagers and you old people, you're not cool, you're not like us. So what happens if, like, especially if you're from a Western country, if your mother or father tries to start speaking slang, trying to speak like a teenager like you say, "Oh, Dad, stop it, come on. You don't know how to be cool. Come on, just give it up, You can't, it's not allowed. You're an old person, you can't talk like us." So teenagers will react against that. A token agreement, sometimes agreeing, a token agreement, you just pretend to agree with somebody. Token compliments, you pretend to give somebody a compliment. That was thank you for that very interesting talk. Small talk, gossip, ritual complaints. So you might engage in small talk with somebody by complaining about, "Oh, that was a really hard exam," or, "Oh, that English professor is really crazy," or, "Oh, the weather really sucks," and you commiserate with each other talking about a complaint. Seeking agreement, like tag questions. What kind of intonation to use with tag questions? And so the confusing thing, of course, in English, tag questions is it's a copy of the verb, but with the opposite kind of polarity. So if the main verb is positive, like "are going," the tag is negative, "aren't you?" And "you're not going, are you?" If the main verb is negative, the tag is positive. That's confusing. What kind of intonation do you use on these things? What's the difference between saying, you're going tomorrow, aren't you? And "you're going tomorrow, aren't you?" What's the difference? The second one has more of a rising intonation at the end. "You're going tomorrow, aren't you?" So the second one, you actually are asking a real question. Are you really going? You're going, aren't you? But you're not sure, so you're actually asking a real question for information. The first one with more of a falling intonation, "You're going, aren't you?" It's more like you're just seeking confirmation. I think he's going, I'm just going to seek confirmation. So there are actually two kinds of tags in English with different intonations. The actual kind of questioning tag, the actual information seeking tag, then the confirmation tag, "aren't you?" with a low intonation. And by the way, this is something that is, if you're not a native English speaker, the English tags are really weird the way you do them. In other languages, it's something kind of simple, like in German, like "nicht, nicht wahr?" Or in French, like "no," or I guess in Spanish is "no," right? Just that. Or in English, sometimes you can say "all right." Canadians have a simple way, so if you're struggling with this in English, just use the Canadian "a." It's convenient. Maybe a few people may not be used to it, but it is convenient. You don't have to worry about what's the verb form. Just say, "A, great game, eh? That was a hard test, eh? You're going, eh?" So I like the Canadian "a." I've picked it up from my Canadian friends. So many good things we can learn from Canada, like their government and healthcare system too. Okay, in-group slang. Famous example, of course, there are all kinds of different types of in-group slang in different cultures. One famous kind for linguists is Cockney. Do you know Cockney? It's a sort of working class in kind of London and maybe other cities in England. Some people who are kind of in lower class, so to speak, lower class, working class people, they speak Cockney. So sometimes if you watch a British TV show, maybe a sitcom, and one of the characters has a particularly difficult accent, it might be a Cockney accent. You've got a bottle of beer. You've got a bottle of beer, maybe a bottle of Guinness, eh? That might be Cockney. And it's also known for their famous rhyming slang. So instead of lies, they'll say pork pies. Instead of pocket, they'll say skyrocket. Bar, we're going to the Jack Tar. Or they might even shorten it more to say we're going to the Jack. Or shut up your north and south. Or shut up your north. So they're always making up new expressions because then the other British people, oh, this is cool stuff. I want to learn Cockney slang. Well, like, you're not one of us. Don't use our language. And so they'll keep making up more words, more slang rhymes to keep their dialect sort of a secret from the non-Cockney people who aren't part of their social group. Positive politeness, things like honorifics. So a lot of European languages have kind of a two-level system, a you form for the formal you and an informal for the informal you, like the French vous and tu, the Spanish usted and tu, the German sie and du, and what's the Russian zi and ti, is that right? And then Korean, of course, Korean and Japanese are quite famous among linguists for their complicated, like 6 levels of honorific markers, particularly in the verbs. The verbs and also sometimes the pronouns, or they're kind of pronoun substitutes. Well, you don't usually address somebody as 당신, but there are other expressions that are more formal. And other kinds of vocabulary words, like the ege dative marker, and instead of 주무세요, and instead of 자요, things like that. Words for sleep, words for certain things, eating, 먹다 versus 드시다 and such, 있다 versus 계시다 in Korean. Sometimes using questions for positive politeness. Did you do well on the test? Also expressions of solidarity or reciprocity. For example, promising to help somebody, making offers to help somebody. Including in some cultures pro forma. So pro forma is a Latin expression meaning you don't really mean it, it's just a kind of a token offer, a token or pro forma offer. So in your cultures, do you ever, if you're trying to maybe just out of politeness, you might just say, oh, let's get together sometime, or let's have lunch sometime, or you should come over to my house sometime and have dinner with us. Do you ever do that in your culture? How many of you do it in your culture? Okay, India, China, yeah, so I've encountered this. I've been to both Taiwan and China. I got to interact with the culture more in Taiwan. So I experienced that in Taiwan, so Chinese culture, I know that. Pakistan, okay. Malaysia, so it's interesting. It's maybe less common in American culture, and it could be a source of cultural confusion. Oh, you invited me over, when do you want to meet? No, it's just a token invitation. It was just to be nice. It's an expression of either positive politeness or an expression of positive politeness, a way of I want to be nice to you. I don't really mean it, I'm just making a token promise or a token offer. Don't take it literally. And this could be a source of misunderstanding, especially for Americans, and we tend to be more literal about this. We wouldn't invite somebody over unless we really mean it, more likely. And negative politeness. So I talked about softeners. Another term for softeners is a hedge. So if you think like an American or British house, if you have a house, you might have a fence, or you might have like a hedge, a shrub or a bush that kind of marks the boundary of your house and your yard. So a hedge is something that either protects your face and or protects the face of the other person. So in other words, for example, a softener. So you might say, would you, could you, or we're probably going to do this, likely. Different kinds of hedges, probably, maybe, I think, or I believe that, such and such. In order to hedge maybe your commitment to the statement, or to hedge the other person's face politeness. In questions, minimizing the imposition, again and some of these are kind of hedges too. I just want to ask you if I could borrow a little bit of cash. So you have all these softeners, these hedges, like just, want to ask, could, a little bit of, different ways of hedging and minimizing the face-threatening act. Honorifics, and including third-person expressions, maybe for positive as well as negative politeness. Would Your Majesty like something to eat? Something like that. Plural pronouns like we, politeness function words like thank you, you're welcome, of course, apologies, excuse me, so you're apologizing for interrupting somebody. Giving a reason for an imposition. Sorry, but I really, really need some help here. Sometimes indirectness, including answers that may be deliberately vague or ambiguous. Maybe in a business negotiation, and somebody asks you if you want to, or you ask somebody if you want to, okay, are you interested in this deal? between our two companies, and maybe say, well, the other person maybe says, well, think about it, or maybe instead of outright saying no, you're going to be deliberately ambiguous to avoid negative face-threatening act. Metaphors and idioms sometimes. In English, for example, if somebody important or someone close to you has died, you may not say he's died. You would say he or she passed away. It's kind of a euphemism, or I should have the word here, euphemism for kind of a metaphorical expression that makes it lighter, euphemism. As well as sometimes you can also use metaphors to heighten or emphasize something. Other linguistic devices. Let's say, I want to go to Busan. Could I borrow your car? What would you say? Okay, you can say, I don't have a car. Good response. Or let me pick on someone else. I want to take my family to Busan. Could I borrow your car? Now let's say you have a car. Could I borrow your car? I want to take my family to Busan. Now notice what she said at first. Maybe you said that too. Why do you say You need thinking space. So is, for one thing, is a filler. So sometimes when you need time to think of what to say, you say and so you're going to need to, you're signaling, I need some time to think about this, a couple of seconds. That's one way of doing it. What's another kind of marker you might start with? Is one kind of a discourse particle or discourse marker. What's something else? Okay, so let's say you have a car. Can I borrow your car? I need to take my family to Busan. Because it's kind of an awkward request. Somebody just asked to borrow your car. And maybe it's your brother or sister, sure, but for someone else to make that request. Can I borrow your car? Yeah, see, for how long do you need it? So it's kind of hedging. You're not saying no outright, you're saying for how long. So people might say, or they might say, well. Nobody said well. I usually get well when I do this with the class. Well is another thing for what we call a dispreferred response. I'm expecting you to say yes, but you obviously can't say yes. It's quite an imposition upon you. So you're maybe going to either buy time and say or you're going to say well, and well is a discourse particle, we call it. And one thing that it does is it prefaces or kind of starts a dispreferred response, a response that is maybe not what the listener wants to hear or expects to hear. It's a dispreferred response marker. So we have this class of things, okay, well, like. And different linguists call these different things. Some call them discourse markers, but then some linguists use the word discourse marker for something else as well. Like connectors such as because, since, for. We'll look at those briefly. Transitional words. And other linguists will call these things like okay, well, discourse particles. So I'm going to go with the term discourse particles for these little things. These things like well, like okay, they're discourse particles. They're different from other discourse markers. They're different from other things like since, because, and, or, because these discourse particles, they're not a regular part of the syntax. It would be, if you're drawing a syntactic tree, you might just leave them out, or it's kind of hard to, where do they go in a syntactic tree? They don't fit into like typical lexical categories or trees. And they're also kind of different intonationally. They're not necessarily part of the main sentence intonation. They're kind of outside, like, well, then I pause, and then I start the rest of the sentence. Well, I don't think so. So there's maybe a pause. Has kind of its own intonation unit. So we treat these things a little differently than other things in the syntax. So well, what's it doing here? Well, it's signaling a dispreferred response. Can I borrow your car? Well, let me think about that. Sometimes, maybe if you're switching a topic and you're signaling, well, I know you want to keep talking about what you're doing, but let's get started with the meeting, okay? Well, like I was saying, so maybe the response is dispreferred, or you're making a topic shift. Let's get back to what we were discussing earlier, or let's get back to business. We're kind of digressing. Let's get back to the main point of our meeting. Sometimes there's a kind of a pause or lull in the conversation. People run out of things to say, and kind of as a joke in American culture, we might say, well, how about that World Cup soccer, or something totally unrelated to what we were saying before. So dispreferred responses. Here's some other examples. Somebody says, oh, you need a master's degree for that. And A says, well, I think even more than that. So A is kind of prefacing or mitigating a dispreferred response, contradicting what B said, but more politely contradicting what B said. Or B says, well, I kind of need my car. Okay. Well, I kind of need it. You're prefacing a dispreferred response. So here's more examples of topic shifts and delays. Sometimes, especially when you are deliberately making a face-threatening act, like you're giving an order to your child or to your employee below you, for example, you might say, well, to indicate that what they are doing is dispreferred behavior. Well, hurry up. Well, hurry up, stop playing with the water and take your shower, I say to my son. Or, well, I don't think so. Who wants to know? Well, I want to know. Like, why aren't you telling me? I want to know. So you're signaling that the other person's behavior or what they said to you is dispreferred. I want the information. Or, oh, that's no big deal. Well, that's no big deal. It's not that big a deal. O, when you look at O in these examples, take a minute. What's the function of O here? Kind of surprise. Yeah, it's kind of indicating like surprise or realization. We would call it a realization marker. Oh, like, oh, I didn't realize that. Oh, really? And in the second one here, what is it? Oh, I didn't talk to him. My lunch partner told me about him. So correcting misconception, or pragmatics, what we call repair, conversational repair. So in a sense, it can come from the realization sense, like, oh, I didn't realize I wasn't clear enough, or I realized that you misunderstood me, or maybe I forgot to explain something, but it was my lunch partner that talked to that guy. So it is also used for conversational repair. So realization sometimes, and a related function of what we call conversational repair. Oh, you misunderstood me. Here's some more examples for repair. Oh, maybe it was 1978, we're repairing what you said. The second example is realization marker again. Oh, I see, kind of realization. Oh, I see. Oh is sometimes maybe used, you need to think, oh, I realize, you have to think, how many do I really need? Oh, I'll take 30 of them. So it's kind of like an approximation after you really need to think, oh, how many do I really need? Oh, okay, I realize I need 30 of them. I mean, of course, is another repair marker, but I mean is kind of like a whole phrase that's been reduced to something like a discourse marker, or maybe a discourse particle, and it's for repair. I don't know the scientist, I mean the engineer. So it's another repair marker. Okay, So yeah, it was that became more popular in kind of like the 1950s or 1960s. Yeah, so it was, so my, an old professor I had once told us that in a pragmatics class that his wife's parents would react against him saying, like, blah, blah, blah. And they would say, no, I don't know. What do you mean by that? Well, it was not that common, I guess, before the 1950s, but it's common now in spoken English. The moron is president, that really bugs me. I can't wait forever, So what does mean? What's its function? It's a sort of politeness management function because it's saying, well, I don't think that you're dumb. I don't think that you're ignorant. I'm just stating this anyway. So it's like, that moron is president, Like, yeah, you probably know. I'm just stating it for myself. So it's kind of politeness management function. So these discourse markers, discourse particles, can have two different functions. One is managing the flow of information, and two, politeness function strategies, or another conversation management purpose. Okay, what does okay mean? Okay, well, what does it mean? Try it with different intonations. What kind of different meanings do you get? Try it like, okay, okay, okay. What does it mean when you say okay, 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 okay? Can you think of like an overall function? And what are the different meanings? So first, what are the different meanings that you get with different intonations? Okay, no, it's like, okay, clean up your room. The child says, okay. So like, I don't want to really clean up my room, but okay, because you say so. can express annoyance with a kind of a, especially particularly falling intonation. What are other meanings of okay? You know, like, oh, I'm in trouble now. Okay. Kind of like scared. Okay, so just simple agreement. Could be just simple agreement. Okay, sounds cool. I like that. Okay, okay, like kind of questioning, puzzled. You're kind of agreeing, but you're puzzled. Okay. As maybe somebody says something strange to you, and you say, okay. Or you read what Donald Trump tweeted last night. Okay. Guy needs help. So you have different meanings. So the overall kind of function of all of these is kind of information receipt. You're acknowledging receipt of information. You're acknowledging I understand you. And then with your intonation, you can signal different nuances. I understand what you're saying and I agree, or I'm puzzled, or yes, but I'm annoyed, or I don't really want to do it, but, or yes, and oh, I'm in trouble, I realize. Information receipt, you acknowledge that you have understood the person's message, and maybe with your intonation you might convey some extra meaning too. The second one is a little different. Okay, so you're with some friends, you've finished your meal together at a restaurant, you've been chatting for a while, and then you say, okay, let's get going. It's kind of what we call a pre-closing, is say, okay, let's kind of start closing down our conversation and you know, let's leave, get out of here. I have a class at 4 o'clock or something like that. Kind of signaling, okay, let's kind of finish, let's wind things down and get going, pre-closing. So you're inviting people to say, let's get ready to leave. Now, at the beginning of a sentence, is not a time adverb. Now, as I was saying, what does this function as? Now, as I was saying, and it might be said with a higher intonation, now, as I was saying. So maybe you were talking about something and you kind of got off topic and you're talking about something else. And you come back, now, as I was saying, it's a topic shift marker. And things like this are good to know if you need to do something in English, like a class presentation. These kinds of things are useful to know. A topic shift marker, you were talking about something and you want to get back to a previous topic. Now, as I was saying. And then another thing I did is that high intonation. And you notice that sometimes professors do this in lectures, for example, or people do it in presentations. Sort of like in text, you have paragraphs that tell you topic shift. The function of a paragraph in text is a topic shift. You're switching to a new topic in the next line in your argument in your essay. In spoken discourse, a high intonation at the beginning is a topic shift marker also. Now let's move on to blah, blah, blah. Okay. Now let's move on to sociolinguistics, that's actually our next class. But I could do that as a transition to a new topic. Or I could, so some linguists actually call that high intonation that signals a topic shift. A paratone is kind of like a paragraph intonation to shift topics. And then I can also combine it with now, meaning let's get back to what we were talking about earlier. Though, at the end of sentences is kind of a more recent phenomenon. So one time I was teaching a class, this was back in the States, in Illinois. It was a writing class for graduate students. And I noticed one of my students, she was from Latin America, she was like writing down something when I hadn't really said anything meaningful. Like, oh, and I said, what are you writing? She said, oh, I'm writing down the times when you end sentences with though, because I don't understand why you're doing it. She wasn't used to it. So, and it's maybe more of a distinctly North American thing. I don't know if British people do it, but have you heard English speakers end sentences with though? It sounds normal to us from the US. Have you heard that? Because this student was puzzled by it. She'd never maybe heard that before. It's kind of common in colloquial North American English now. It's kind of like as an afterthought, though for comparison. And I guess I should, I don't know if I've come across any studies of this. I should look it up. If not, I should do my own study. I used to do a little pragmatics research when I was in grad school. It's kind of fun. I don't really know though. So it's maybe a politeness function thing. Like, I'm sorry, I can't tell you. I'm guessing it's a politeness function, a negative politeness function marker. Like, I'm sorry, I don't know. It's kind of contrary to your expectations. Your expectation was that I would know, but sorry, I don't know. Back channel markers and filler markers. So we talked about is a pause filler. Is it okay if a professor uses all the time? How do you feel when I do that? You know, how do you feel if you're listening to somebody talking and they keep using kind of annoying, right? it's like the person hasn't rehearsed enough. Now sometimes we need these filler markers to fill in pauses because sometimes you need a second to think of what you're going to say. And these things maybe more often come in the middle of a sentence or so, because often the first part of the sentence is kind of old information. The first part of the sentence, your subject, maybe your main verb and stuff. Maybe it's stuff you mentioned before in the linguistic context. But the rest of the sentence, maybe the predicate, it could be the object, or predicate complement, could even be the verb itself or what comes after the verb. That tends to be the newer information, and sometimes we pause right there in the middle of the sentence with a pause marker. Now, what if I just don't fill my pauses? Just a silent pause. Sometimes if you're doing public speaking, it might be better to make a silent pause and not fill it with so because can get annoying, and it kind of signals not really prepared, or I just can't think of what to say because I haven't had enough coffee, my brain's not working. So a little tip for public speaking. We also use these things for other purposes. You're listening to somebody, the person is talking at length, and how do you indicate that you're listening? Like, I'm listening, or I understand you, or maybe even I agree with you. What do you say? And of course, you also maybe shake your head, nod your head, and you say, Usually with maybe a rising, falling intonation, yeah, maybe yeah, and such. So these are also called feedback, or sometimes back channel markers. Some people call them feedback markers. Sometimes, especially in pragmatics, people call them back channel markers. And these are all kind of related because we sometimes took the pause markers and use them also as feedback markers, or vice versa. I'm not sure what the origin is. And in pragmatics, people do entire research papers on these things. I once met at a conference a woman who's doing a whole PhD dissertation on You could do that, I guess. Pragmatics is kind of fun. And there are, of course, limitations. You can't just, sometimes a silent pause is better than a filled pause with If you keep going, people might wondering, are you okay? Do you need to see a doctor? Are you having a stroke? And sometimes a longer pause marker. Sometimes you could use, if you need a longer pause, maybe it's better just to say, well, let me think, or something else. Maybe you're like, if it's a younger audience. So like we talked about before, it's kind of an in-group marker, and it is sometimes kind of an approximator or a hedge. Approximator means I approximately mean this. So in the first example, like, could you loan me like $200? You're using it as a softener or as a hedge marker, like, I'm sorry for this request. In other cases, like I asked him, it's kind of like, for example, it's like he just like sits around all day watching football and like doing nothing. And it could be a softener, and it could also, to soften the content, maybe he doesn't literally do nothing all day, but it's kind of like that. And maybe he does something, maybe he moves a little bit to put food in his mouth or something, but I don't mean he literally absolutely does absolutely nothing, but something kind of like that. So it could be kind of a softener or approximator. And I've noticed it tends to, in my research, I notice it kind of tends to come before the new information. So it's also maybe highlighting new information as well as softening it, or softening maybe politeness functions. Kind of hedging might be my commitment to it. Like, I can't say no for 100%, absolutely sure that he does nothing, but I'm pretty certain that's the case, that something like that is true. This is a subfield of pragmatics called conversation analysis. Is kind of interesting. So if you like this stuff, and especially want to study particularly sociopragmatics of conversation, including things like politeness function words like thank you, or of intonation, or of these discourse particles like okay. You might like conversation analysis. I've dabbled with it a bit myself. It's kind of interesting. You study those kinds of issues mainly by taking actual conversations. So in other areas of pragmatics, you could rely on maybe plain transcriptions of conversations, or other texts, written texts, and explore the pragmatics. With conversation analysis, you record an actual live conversation between normal speakers in a normal context, and you do very detailed transcription. You transcribe not only what they say, but things like intonation and pauses. Every single pause, you time it, and you look at it. and you look at their turn-taking and overlaps, when they take turns and how they take turns and how they respond to each other. And you look at maybe face politeness, feedback, repair, pauses. Now sometimes they try to guess speakers' communicative intentions, and sometimes I find it a little bit questionable. I think unless you have enough background in social psychology, you have to be, I think they should be careful about that. But still, it is an interesting field. And also things like turn-taking, holding the floor, and pauses and overlaps. So holding the floor means who is speaking and who is kind of given the right to speak in the conversation. So in conversation, you can go back and forth. You take turns talking. At one point, one person will be talking, and we say that they hold the floor. This is an expression that comes from parliamentary procedure. So if you watch British Parliament or maybe U.S. House, U.S. Congress proceedings, one person is granted the right to speak for a while, then they finish, and the speaker who manages everything gives somebody else the right to speak. And the speaker who is managing things prevents other people from interrupting. And John Bercow in British Parliament will say, "Order, order! The Right Honourable Gentleman from Nottingham is speaking, please." Or, "Prime Minister, please, Prime Minister, the Prime Minister is speaking, Prime Minister." You know, he'll manage the interruptions and direct the discourse back to the person who has the floor. In your culture, is it considered okay to overlap? As one person is still speaking or is finishing their sentence, is it okay for another person just to jump in? Or do you need to actually wait for that person to stop? Spanish speakers, okay, who's a Spanish speaker? Can we have a Spanish speaker? Some Spanish-speaking cultures are kind of known for allowing overlaps. It's okay if you're talking and you're kind of, while you're talking, and maybe getting to the end of your sentence, somebody else might jump in, and two people might talk at the same time. Would you be comfortable with that? I would find it annoying. It would be hard for me to get used to. In a lot of cultures, maybe you wait for one person to stop speaking and allow for a little pause. As one person is finishing the sentence and you want to speak, do you wait? Or how do you know when to start speaking? Do you wait, and how long do you wait? And there, even within a big country like the US, there can be some slight variation. I grew up in Texas, where we tend to wait a little bit longer out of Texan politeness, maybe a half a second. But you move to New York, and it's like, you gotta be quick, you gotta jump in. And so if it's a culture where you have to kind of jump in a little more assertively, how do you know when to start talking? Because sometimes for foreign students from East Asian cultures who go to the US and they're in a classroom where they have to speak up, like a seminar style classroom, this can be kind of challenging. I guess in Korean culture, do you wait, right? Like what, a second, half a second? In Chinese culture maybe? Or do you just interrupt? But in Chinese culture, do you interrupt? Is it natural to overlap? This kind of varies in different cultures. You might actually allow for a half-second pause, a full second, or maybe just a tenth of a second, 2/10 of a second. This is something you can study in conversation analysis. And it could be like a slight difference between Texas and New York. And if you don't jump in, people are going to think that you're weak or you're shy or something. A little clue, though, for those of you who are going to maybe go to another culture, and for example, in English, in North America, we can, if one person is talking and you hear the intonation going down, it kind of means, oh, they're about to finish their sentence and I need to jump in. And so I might say something that indicates I want to speak next. So what do? You need to jump into the conversation. So what do you do to indicate you want to talk? As one person is kind of finishing, their intonation is going down, they're going to stop, it seems. What do? You might say, and it indicates I want to say something. Or even if it's kind of a small seminar-style classroom, maybe just breathe in audibly. It's a little trick that kind of says, oh, I want to say something, I want to speak next. So this is kind of turn-taking and kind of taking the floor. You want to signal that you want to take the floor, you want to speak next and hold the floor. And there are cultural differences and pauses and overlaps. And it would be a good thing to learn about these if you're going to maybe work for an international company and you want to work in another country, or you deal with people from different cultures. This is something you should find out about. What are the rules of conversational interaction in that culture? Because if you don't know the difference, you could have misunderstandings or communication breakdowns. Now, moving beyond the little discourse particles to the wider range of discourse markers, there are other things we use for connecting ideas and thoughts, for managing information, as well maybe also for politeness considerations. So there's a wider range of things that we call discourse markers. I'm going to use the term discourse markers for the wider category. These include various things that are called connectors or connectives or transitionals. things like normal logic connectors, logical connectors like because, since, thus, therefore. Conjunctive adverbs like use however, furthermore, therefore, thus to indicate, to manage the flow of information. Sentence final particles feature of especially East Asian languages. So Chinese, you end sentences maybe sometimes with ma to indicate questions, ba, like 我们走吧, suggestion, let's go. Japanese, Korean has some either clause final markers or sentence final markers like hesa or hanika, I guess, ga or asa for because of sense, and they have kind of slightly different nuances. Sentence adverbs like fortunately, so you start a sentence with fortunately, naturally indicates kind of your stance, your evaluation of the information of the sentence, your attitude towards what you're saying. These are some of your logical connectors, something you learn in a writing class maybe, especially a beginning or intermediate writing class. Emphatic adverbs, even only, especially. In formal writing, in English, do you start a sentence with especially? Especially, we want to argue that blah, blah, blah. Would you say that in a formal academic English paper, or not really? Because especially is an emphatic marker, and then when you put it at the beginning of a sentence, that usually makes it a sentence adverb. And it kind of, it's okay, it's normal in colloquial or informal English, but in formal English, we don't really do it as much because you're trying to, if you put it there at the very beginning of the sentence, you're emphasizing the entire sentence. And it's sort of like typing an email in all capital letters, like shouting at somebody. And it kind of breaks the flow for academic style English. So in academic writing, we don't usually start sentences with especially as a sentence adverb. Then we have topic shift markers, and these tend to be more colloquial. Now, as I was saying, as regards topic shift markers, we have there is, there are, we mentioned before, it's often for presenting a new topic to the discourse. You look out your window and you see a unicorn in your garden. You say, oh, there's a unicorn in my garden. This is a famous example from a linguist named James Macaulay, who was known for his sense of humor. Or there with an intransitive verb. And by the way, I did some research and I found that Korean writers, when they're trying to do academic English writing, tend to overuse there, like there is, there are. And the reason of it is, of course, in Korean you're thinking of ita, which has a wider range of meanings in Korean, because it means what? Be, exist, there is, there are, have. But it doesn't translate as well into academic English, because in academic English it's not used as much and its function is more limited to introducing a new topic to the discourse when we can just easily use a new paragraph or just start a sentence with a full noun subject. Or you could use, maybe it might sound better to use there with another intransitive verb, like there appears or there appeared, there arose. So another area of pragmatics is discourse analysis, or it overlaps with discourse analysis, particularly if you're looking at text and looking at some of the more linguistic structures of text and how they're influenced by the context and communicative purposes. One example of things you can do in maybe discourse analysis or pragmatics is looking at information management, topic and focus. So we talked about topic. We talked about old information. So the subject, maybe the verb of the sentence, that's usually about something you mentioned before, especially the sentence subject. That's kind of old information or topic, the topic of what you're talking about. And then the new information is what we call the focus. And sometimes you have to pause maybe for half a second and say or just a silent pause to think of that, what you're going to say, what you're going to put in the predicate, because that's new information, or sometimes focus, particularly the most important new information. And sometimes the more important new information is marked with a sentence stress, or sometimes it might be the new information in the predicate, or maybe I want to put special emphasis and contrast on something. So here's an example from a TED Talk. I'll switch to a British accent because the speaker is British. This is from one of the more famous talks on TED.com, Ken Robinson talking about education, very provocative talk. As I say this, listen to the stress or intonation and listen if there is maybe one word in each sentence that has more stress, more prominent intonation and stress than the other nouns or other important words of the sentence. Now, our education system is predicated on the idea of academic ability, and there's a reason The whole system was invented. Around the world, there were no public systems of education really before the 19th century. They all came to being to meet the needs of industrialism. So the hierarchy is rooted in two ideas. Number one, that the most useful subjects for work were at the top. So you probably steer benignly away from things at school when you were a kid, things you liked, on the grounds that you would never get a job doing that. Is that right? Don't do music, you're not going to be a musician. Don't do art, you won't be an artist. Benign advice, now profoundly mistaken. So do you hear, he pronounces it with very clear stresses. Did you hear what words were more stressed than others? At least one in each clause or each utterance. What words, for example? Predicated. It's predicated. So he's putting special emphasis on predicated, on the idea of academic ability. And he might, if you take a breath pause and he says on academic ability, I might put another emphasis on ability because it's like the key new information, the key concept of the predicate. There's a reason. So more emphasis on reason, clear, prominent intonation going really up and then down at the end of sentences. The whole system was invented. So meaning kind of a voice intonation unit invented, kind of new information stress. Around the world, there are no public systems of education really before the 19th century. Again, new information stress, 19th century, stressing the key information. Came into being to meet the needs of industrialism. So using stress to highlight either the key new word or concept or information, especially in a predicate, or sometimes special emphasis or contrast. Special emphasis on predicated. Now our education system is predicated on the idea of academic ability. Or here's a contrast. Don't do music, you're not going to be a musician. Don't do art, you won't be an artist. Okay, contrast of stress, kind of special emphasis. This is something that is done in English. And it's sort of important in English because it helps with the flow of information and the speaker's ideas and the speaker's intention. Okay. Another thing you might study in discourse analysis or pragmatics in general, Deixis, I'm not going to spend too much on this. This is kind of more formal pragmatics, but Deixis or deictic means reference. So it literally means in Greek pointing to. So pronouns, if you use she, it is pointing to a particular person that was mentioned in the discourse. So pronouns like he, she, they are deictic. They point to, refer to a particular person. So the referent thing it refers to. And there are other proforms besides pronouns. So anaphora or anaphora is kind of, well, the pronoun is an anaphor. It's a deictic word, and it refers back to something else. But also sometimes nouns can be anaphoric, referring back to a noun that was mentioned before in the sentence. So usually a pronoun refers to something that was mentioned before. But I can do the opposite here. If it refers back to something that was mentioned before that's anaphoric, if I said, Lorraine, blah, 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 and then I say she, that's an anaphor. It's referring back to something mentioned before. Or in this case, while she waited for him, Lorraine decided to leave. Now in formal English, you can do this. You can do this when the first clause is a dependent or subordinate clause. You can do this. So that's a cataphor, cataphora. It's referring forward to a name that's mentioned in the main clause. And in formal English, you can do this. So she is kind of it's a deictic pronoun that's referring cataphorically to Lorraine here. Or Trump took office in January 2017. Since then, the Cheeto dictator. So it's kind of an anaphor, an alternate noun phrase for Trump, who is mentioned before. So it's kind of anaphoric, sort of like a pronoun. Some other proforms, verbal auxiliaries can be kind of anaphoric. Going to the conference, I think so. So is kind of a pro-verbal, predicate element, referring back to going to the conference. I really want to. The to is not a preposition in this case, like I want to go. To go, it's an infinitive particle. And this is one thing that shows you that this infinitive particle to really functions like a verbal auxiliary because it can be anaphoric like other verbal auxiliaries. I really want to go. Or I should have, meaning I should have gone to the conference. So have, or do you plan to go? I do. So verbal auxiliaries like do and have can be anaphoric. You can just say I should have with a have, is anaphoric to the whole predicate before that. And this test shows you that to is essentially like an auxiliary verb in this case. It's kind of like an auxiliary verb. And there's a famous linguistics paper in syntax and semantics from several decades ago about this that proved this, that to is kind of like is a sort of auxiliary, a special auxiliary verb. So we talked about clefs and WH clefs for contrast and emphasis. Some other kinds of special discourse structure functions. Inversion, you mentioned this before, you put an adjective phrase or prepositional phrase before the verb and the subject comes after the verb. And this is a narrative technique, like in storytelling, for example, and you see this in stories and fiction and sometimes in academic English. It's for making a topic shift, shifting to a related topic, introducing a new but related topic to the discourse. Preposing, or dislocation or topicalization, has several different functions. It can be used for emphasis, contrast, or for topic shifts, shifting back to a previous topic. An area of study that's kind of similar to discourse analysis and pragmatics can be corpus analysis. So corpus is the singular, plural in Latin is corpora, a collection of, for example, text. For example, I have about one corpus. It's a collection of about texts from different kinds of writing, different genres, and they're tagged. They're indicated with like what's the syntactic category of this word. And there's about maybe 1 billion words, many different texts. I've used it for research. And one thing you can do if you have a corpus of like writings by native English speakers and then writings by second language learners, so I have like a small corpus of writings by Korean students writing in English, and I can do comparisons. The first language patterns and how they use some of these things like discourse markers or certain words, vocabulary, or discourse, various structures, and the Koreans. And so these are some things I've noticed in my research. I'll point you to an article if you want to about this, but overuse of certain things, underuse of other things, but I don't have time to really get into this, but these are some things I've noticed. Don't have time to talk about A or the today. I hope to, but these are things where the grammatical rules don't really work. Maybe I'll add more in like an online lecture about some of these things later on. How many of you think that this pragmatic stuff is more interesting than the grammar stuff, the phonology and the syntax and the morphology? And that's understandable because, some of that stuff, especially the grammar and the phonology, appeals to the nerd in me. But pragmatics is sort of like the playground of linguistics. You can have fun with it. You can do serious academic research and have fun with it. And it's also practical. And especially if you're going into language teaching, you should probably take a pragmatics course. Or if you want to work for an international company and deal with people from other cultures and language backgrounds, it would help to take a pragmatics course and learn about this, because that's where communication problems often arise, is due to different cultural differences, especially including those that are kind of expressed in the different pragmatics. Different languages have really different pragmatics. And it's really important to know that if you want to live or deal with or work with a foreign culture or speakers of other cultures and languages. So if those are your maybe future plans, learn some more pragmatics, take a pragmatics course or two. Next week we get into sociolinguistics, which is also maybe relevant if you're interested in that stuff. So no homework, I'm sorry, but enjoy.